The morning sun spilled its golden light across the sleepy town of Elmsworth. The streets were still damp from last night's rain, and a thin mist clung to the rooftops like a secret that refused to leave. In the small corner house on Willow Lane, Eleanor Hart stood by the kitchen window, stirring her tea without really noticing it. She had always been a woman of words, a teacher, a storyteller, someone who believed that language could heal the deepest wounds. But for the past 6 months, she had barely spoken a dozen sentences. It wasn't because she had lost her voice. It was because she had chosen not to use it. People in the town whispered about her silence. Some said she was heartbroken. Others believed she had taken a vow, like the monks in faraway monasteries. The truth was far more complicated. Eleanor's last day at Elmsworth High School was still fresh in her mind. It had been an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where the sky looked neither happy nor sad. She had been teaching her literature class, reading a poem aloud about the quiet strength of mountains, when a student named Michael Reed had stood up and said something cruel. Not about the poem, but about her. It was the kind of insult that slices through you like cold steel, not because it's loud, but because it's true in ways you wish it weren't. Eleanor had felt her chest tighten, her words freeze, and in that moment, something inside her broke. She finished the lesson without speaking another word, and the next day, she didn't speak either, or the day after that. The town's librarian, Mrs. Grafton, often visited her. "You can't just stop talking, Eleanor," she would say, placing a plate of warm scones on the table. Eleanor would smile politely, but her lips stayed sealed. Somehow, she found a strange comfort in the quiet. It was as if, for the first time in years, she could truly hear the world. The ticking of thing, clock, the rustle of the leaves, the distant call of a train. In silence, the smallest sounds became stories. But silence was not without its challenges. When she went to the market, the shopkeepers looked at her with pity. At church, people prayed for her healing, though they didn't understand that she wasn't ill. And at night, the loneliness in her house seemed to grow heavier, settling into every corner. One rainy afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the park, she saw a boy sitting alone on a bench. He was sketching in a worn notebook, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. She stopped for a moment, curious. The boy looked up and met her eyes. "Do you speak?" he asked bluntly. Eleanor shook her head gently. "That's okay," he said, with a small smile. "I don't talk much either." It was the beginning of something neither of them expected, a connection built entirely without words. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, thinking about the boy. His name, she would later learn, was Noah, and he had his own reasons for keeping quiet. She didn't know it yet, but their silent friendship would lead her to a truth she had been running from all her life. In the darkness of her room, she realized something. Silence wasn't an escape. It was a mirror. And sooner or later, it would force her to face everything she had been avoiding. A week later, Emily found herself walking through the university gardens. The morning air was cool, filled with the scent of fresh roses. She carried her notebook, but for the first time, she wasn't planning to write her speech. She was simply observing. An old gardener, his hands rough and covered in soil, was trimming the bushes nearby. Emily watched him work in silence. She noticed how he moved slowly, with patience, as if each cut of the scissors was an act of care. When she finally asked, "Why do you work so quietly?" the gardener smiled without looking up. "Because flowers don't grow faster when you talk," he said. "They grow when you give them space, light, and time." The word struck her. She had been so focused on speaking, explaining, proving herself, that she had forgotten the value of space, light, and time. That evening, she sat by her desk with the speech notes in front of her. Instead of filling the pages with endless words, she crossed out entire paragraphs. "What am I doing?" she thought. "If I remove so much, will my speech even make sense?" But deep down, she knew the truth. Silence between words can speak louder than the words themselves. The train ride to the mountains was long but soothing. Through the window, David saw the city fade into endless fields, then winding rivers, and finally, the first glimpse of snow-capped peaks. It was the first time in years that he had switched off his phone completely. No calls, no messages, just the rhythmic sound of the train wheels and the whisper of the wind outside. When he arrived at the small mountain station, an elderly man in a woolen shawl was waiting with a placard that read, "David Harris, Silence Retreat." His name was Arjun, a soft-spoken guide who led him through winding paths to the retreat center. The air grew thinner and cleaner with each step, and the silence deeper. The retreat was nothing like David had imagined. No monks in orange robes chanting, no mystical temples. Just a cluster of simple wooden cabins surrounded by pine trees, with a view of the mountains that looked like they had been painted by an artist. Inside his cabin, there was no TV, no Wi-Fi, no clock, only a bed, a small table, and a notebook. The rules were clear. No talking for 10 days. No reading or writing except for the exercises given. No electronic devices. The first day felt strange. His mind screamed for stimulation, to check the news, to text someone, to do something. But there was nothing to do except watch the trees sway and listen to the distant sound of a waterfall. On the third day, David started noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The patterns of sunlight through the leaves, the sound of pine needles crunching underfoot, the way his own breathing felt like waves rising and falling. He began to understand what the retreat leader had told him in their first and only conversation. "Silence is not the absence of sound, David. It is the presence of yourself." By the fifth day, something inside him began to shift. The constant chatter in his mind started slowing down. He no longer felt the urge to respond to imaginary arguments or replay old mistakes. One evening, while watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold, David realized that for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the past or worrying about the future. He was simply here. The next morning, Ayan stepped outside his apartment in the heart of Mumbai. The streets were buzzing, cars honking, vendors shouting, construction drills screaming. It was as if the entire world was competing to be the loudest. He looked around and realized how much invisible chaos surrounded him daily. For the first time, he noticed that the noise wasn't just sound. It was stealing his thoughts. While walking to work, he passed by a small cafe tucked in a side lane. Through the window, he noticed something unusual. No music, no chatter, just quiet. A small sign read, "Silent Brews, a space for thought." Curious, he entered. The waiter greeted him with a smile, but didn't speak, just pointed to the menu. People were reading, sketching, or sipping coffee in complete silence. It felt like stepping into another world. Ayan sat down with a steaming cappuccino. For the first few minutes, the silence felt strange, even uncomfortable. His mind tried to fill it with random thoughts. But slowly, his breathing matched the calm atmosphere. He began to feel his own heartbeat, the warmth of the cup, the smell of roasted beans. He realized silence wasn't empty. It was full of details he had been missing all along. In the far corner of the cafe sat an elderly man with silver hair, reading a thick book. When Ion glanced at him, the man looked up and gave a small nod. It was a quiet acknowledgement, no words, just presence. Ion wondered how many conversations in life could be replaced by such silent understanding. When Ion was leaving, the cafe's manager finally spoke. "First time here?" "Yes," Ion replied. "It's peaceful." The manager smiled. "Silence is like a mirror. Sometimes it shows you what the noise was hiding." That evening, Ion returned home and decided to try something new. No TV, no music, no phone for 2 hours. At first, his mind screamed for distraction. But then, in the stillness, he began noticing small details, the sound of rain outside, the way shadows danced on his walls, the taste of his tea. He realized he had been rushing through life without really experiencing it. A few days later, Aarav took a long walk to the outskirts of the village. There lay an old, overgrown garden no one visited anymore. The benches were cracked, flowers had grown wild, and a stone fountain stood dry. Yet the place radiated a strange sense of calm. Aarav sat on one of the benches and simply listened. He noticed the rustle of leaves, the buzz of a bee, the chirping of birds in the distance. For the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't filled with noise. It was filled with presence. An elderly gardener, Mr. Soren, appeared from behind a hedge. He smiled warmly, but didn't speak. Aarav, unsure how to respond, just nodded. They worked together for hours in silence, removing weeds, clearing paths, and filling the dry fountain with water from a nearby well. By evening, the garden looked alive again. Before leaving, Mr. Soren finally spoke. Silence doesn't mean the absence of words. It means the presence of peace. Back in the village, Aarav crossed paths with his younger brother, Raghav, whom he had argued with months ago. Neither of them had spoken since that fight. They stood there for a moment, staring awkwardly. Aarav remembered Master Kavi's teaching and simply placed his hand on Raghav's shoulder. No words, just a gesture of reconciliation. Raghav's eyes softened, and with a small nod, he accepted the apology. Silence had spoken louder than any explanation could. The annual village festival was approaching, a time of music, laughter, and noise. Aarav worried that his new calm might get drowned in the chaos. But as the day came, he realized something remarkable. He could enjoy the music without feeling overwhelmed, hear laughter without needing to join every conversation, and simply stand among the crowd while staying deeply connected to himself. It wasn't the world that had grown quieter, it was him who had learned how to listen differently. One morning, Aarav received a letter from his old friend in the city, inviting him back for a big career opportunity. His mind buzzed with possibilities, but this time he didn't rush. He went to the garden, sat quietly, and waited until the noise inside him settled. When the answer finally came, it wasn't from excitement or fear. It was from peace. He realized that no matter where he went, he now carried the real treasure with him, the power of silence. Before making his decision about the city, Aarav felt an urge to return to the place where this journey had truly begun, Master Kavi's mountain hut. The snow was lighter now, and the path felt strangely familiar. When he arrived, Master Kavi was sitting outside, brewing tea over a small fire. Without a word, Kavi handed Aarav a cup. They drank together in silence, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. Finally, Kavi spoke. You came here once to escape noise. Now you return carrying silence within you. Kavi led Aarav into a small cave behind the hut. Inside, there was only darkness, the faint drip of water, and the echo of their own breathing. Stay here until you understand the lesson the cave holds, Kavi said before leaving. At first, Aarav's thoughts raced. Memories, fears, questions. Hours passed. The darkness felt heavier. Then, slowly, his mind grew still. He realized that silence wasn't something to achieve, but something to allow. When Kavi returned, Aarav simply smiled. He didn't need to explain. The master already knew. Before Aarav left the mountain, Kavi gave him a small wooden pendant, carved into the shape of a closed eye. This is to remind you, Kavi said, that the deepest listening happens when you close your eyes to the noise of the world. Back in the village, Aarav rose early and watched the sunrise from his window. The city's offer sat on his desk. The old Aarav would have chosen based on ambition or fear of missing out. The new Aarav chose from a place of clarity. He decided to go, not to escape the village, but to bring the power of silence with him into a noisy world. On the day of departure, the villagers gathered to say goodbye. Aarav hugged his brother, shared a final look with the gardener, and began walking down the road toward the city. He could already hear the distant hum of traffic and the rush of life ahead. But inside him, there was only stillness, like a calm lake untouched by wind. The journey wasn't ending. It was beginning again, in a world where his silence could be his greatest strength. The city greeted Aarav with a wall of noise. Horns blaring, vendors shouting, music spilling from shop fronts. It was overwhelming, but Aarav didn't shrink from it. Instead, he observed it like a river in flood, letting the sounds pass around him without pulling him under. His new job placed him in a bustling newsroom. Phones rang, printers churned, people argued over headlines. In the middle of it, Aarav sat quietly at his desk, focusing entirely on his work. At first, colleagues thought he was aloof, but soon they noticed something. He didn't react to the chaos, and yet he always delivered clear, thoughtful ideas. One afternoon, his editor called him into her office to discuss a tense negotiation with a political figure. Aarav barely spoke during the meeting, only asking short, precise questions. Afterward, the editor looked at him with curiosity. "How did you know he was lying?" she asked. Aarav smiled faintly. His words were loud, but his silences were louder. Over time, his calm presence began to affect others. Colleagues found themselves lowering their voices when he entered. Arguments ended faster. Even in the middle of breaking news frenzies, Aarav remained unshaken. It was as if his silence created a quiet pocket in which people could think clearly. Aarav started a small lunchtime group called the Quiet Hour, where people could gather in a meeting room, sit in silence, and leave refreshed. At first, only 2 colleagues came, then 5, then 10. Eventually, even the editor joined. What started as one man's discipline began to ripple through an entire newsroom. News of Aarav's Quiet Hour spread beyond the newsroom. A local cafe owner asked if he could host a similar event for customers. Soon, every Saturday morning, a group of strangers would gather in the cafe, sip tea, and simply remain silent together. No phones, no chatter, just presence. One day, Aarav received an unexpected letter, an invitation from the mayor's office. They had heard about the growing silent gatherings and wanted him to speak, ironically, about the movement. Aarav accepted but decided to keep his talk brief. At the event, He stood before hundreds and said only, "Silence is not the absence of communication, it is the foundation of understanding." Then he stepped down. The room stayed in stillness for minutes afterward. No one wanted to break the spell. Over the months, the city began to change in subtle ways. Public parks introduced silent zones. Cafes promoted quiet mornings. Even the usually loud subway ran a campaign encouraging moments of calm during commutes. Aarav noticed more people sitting with books, sketch pads, or simply looking at the sky instead of scrolling endlessly on their phones. But not everyone embraced this shift. A group of critics accused the movement of being impractical and elitist. They staged noisy protests outside the cafe gatherings, shouting and playing loud music. Aarav didn't confront them. Instead, he led the group inside and continued the silence. After an hour, many protesters left, puzzled, realizing they weren't being fought, they were being absorbed into stillness. One evening, Aarav received a handwritten letter from his old mentor in the mountains. "The silence you carried into the city has become a river. Let it flow. But remember, true silence is not in the world around you. It is in you. Guard it." Aarav smiled, folded the letter, and placed it in his pocket. Months had passed, and the silent movement was now a citywide phenomenon. But Aarav began to feel a creeping restlessness. His days were filled with people wanting interviews, meetings, and events. Ironically, his life had become noisier than ever, just a different kind of noise. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, Aarav sat alone in his apartment. The ticking of the clock felt unbearably loud. For the first time in years, he realized he had lost his own inner stillness. A phone call shattered his thoughts. It was his sister from the village. His mentor, the old monk who had first taught him about silence, had fallen gravely ill. Without a second thought, Aarav packed his bag and caught the next train to the mountains. The journey took hours. As the train wound through valleys and forests, Aarav stared out at the landscape, trying to reclaim the quiet inside him. But his mind was crowded with worries about his mentor, his movement, and the fear that maybe silence was too fragile to survive in a noisy world. When Aarav reached the monastery, the old monk was lying on a simple bed, breathing weakly. Aarav sat beside him, tears filling his eyes. The monk smiled faintly and whispered, "You brought silence to the world, but have you kept it for yourself?" Aarav bowed his head. The monk took his hand, and with his final breath, said, "Silence is not a gift you give once. It is a garden you must tend daily." Moments later, the room was filled with the deepest, purest. Aarav stayed in the mountains for weeks after the funeral. No events, no movement, no responsibilities. Just him, the wind, and the sound of his own heartbeat. Gradually, the inner calm returned, not as a fragile thing, but as something rooted deep within. When Aarav finally came back to the city, it was different, not because the streets were quieter, but because he was. The honking horns, the chatter of crowds, the roar of markets, none of it disturbed the deep stillness he had brought from the mountains. He didn't rush back into the movement. Instead, he quietly reopened the small community room where it had all started. Instead of organizing massive public silent days, Aarav began offering small circles, no more than 10 people at a time, where they would simply sit together in quiet for an hour. No speeches, no social media, no pressure to prove anything. Silence, he told them one evening, isn't a performance, it's a practice. Some of the people who came to those circles began hosting their own in parks, libraries, and homes. Slowly, without fanfare, silence began weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life, not as a trend, but as a quiet habit. A year later, Aarav city held its first ever Festival of Stillness. There were art exhibits about quiet places, music with long pauses, poetry read in whispers, and entire gardens set aside for meditation. But even in this celebration, there were moments where the whole crowd simply stood together, breathing, listening, and saying nothing. Late that night, Aarav stood on his rooftop, looking over the glowing city. He thought of the monk's last words, "Silence is a garden you must tend daily." He smiled, knowing that the garden was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had learned to keep a little stillness inside them. The story ended not with applause, but with the softest sound, the city's night breeze carrying the faintest echo of calm through its streets. And somewhere, in countless homes and hearts, people closed their eyes and let the power of silence speak.